and demonized by white people have an extraordinary capacity to empathize with another group of people, in this case, Muslims, who are being stereotyped and demonized largely by white people. I intentionally highlight white people to bring race to the forefront as we discuss Islamophobia. We might think about Islamophobia as hate based on religious difference, but for certain, Islamophobia is a form of racism. It is anti-Muslim racism. Racism must be understood as a function of privilege and power, and in the American context, it is the power and privilege that whites assert and enjoy over blacks and other people of color. It is for this reason that Beverly Tatum, sociologist and past president of Spelman College, asserts that people of color are not racist because they do not systematically benefit from racism, even though they can and do have racial prejudices. When black and brown people do act out their prejudices, that is, act as racists, or reproduce the lies of white supremacy, they do so to gain as much power, acceptance, and resources as a racist social order will permit them, always at the expense of their brother or sister of color. In our context, racism represents the policies and propaganda that whites have historically used to maintain their power and privilege. When Europeans colonized African lands and Asian lands, many of which were Muslim lands, racial categories were constructed and given meaning, i.e. that white skin signified civilization, to rationalize the occupation of these lands. In this country, black people had to be dehumanized to rationalize the brutality inflicted against them. At the same time, in Muslim lands like Egypt, colonizers also had to make Muslims inferior to justify occupation. One strategy was to use the platform of white feminism to say that Muslim women needed to be saved from our backward traditional practices, particularly the hijab. This means that originally, white people saw and portrayed the hijab not as a symbol of our faith, but as a symbol of our difference from them, our otherness, our diminished humanity, at least in their eyes, to justify their violence against us. And this is precisely what Islamophobia is: policies and propaganda that seek to demonize, and most presently, ban a group of people who threaten white power and privilege. And this is why scholar activist Suad Abdul Khadir wrote earlier this week in Al Jazeera, the way anti-Muslim racism works is that Muslims, or Islam and Muslims, are a boogeyman, hated and feared because of how they are different, i.e. by how they look and what they do. Muslims are boogeymen not solely because some Muslims are guilty of violent acts against Americans. As was reported not too long ago after white supremacist Dylann Roof killed 9 black Americans in Charleston, white Americans caused the largest number of American deaths by terrorist acts on U.S. soil. Yet, unsurprisingly, Suad continued, Trump has not signed any executive orders specifically targeting white Americans. This is because Islam and Muslims have been othered, made to be seen as distinctly and most despicably bad and evil in the popular imagination. African Americans, like the death poetry poets, defend Islam so seamlessly, to the point that they recite the Muslim greeting of peace perfectly, as though they actually stand in our shoes and don our hijabs, because they know what it feels like to be criminalized. And, as Dr. Suad has noted, and not solely because some of us are guilty of criminal acts, Indeed, as the documentary The 13th proves, Black people were criminalized the moment we were released from the shackles of slavery to turn us to the shackles of incarceration. To be Black and Muslim in this time means that we are steadfast and constant in the fight against racism. For certainly, it is not as though racism just happened to us. Without a doubt, we are alarmed by the current ban on 7 Muslim-majority nations. And the old hate is coming at us in new ways and in flagrant forms less familiar to my generation, but commonly felt in the generations before us. But precisely because of those who came before us and our long-standing spiritual and physical resistance to racism, we quickly draw conviction and courage from the legacy of our ancestors and the prophets and women exemplars of our faith. This is demonstrated in my mother's response to her Christian nephew, who expressed his concern for her in these hateful times. After expressing her gratitude to him, my mother said, "The Quran tells us you can't say you believe and not be expected to be tested like those who came before us. We also say, sufficient is Allah for us. We continually persevere in patience and prayer. We also resist the wrongdoers and defend ourselves." To be Black and Muslim means that African American Muslims are aware of and feel the historical and present-day realities of racism. Not only do we navigate and resist anti-Black racism in everyday acts, like educating our children at home before sending them to the poor schools marking Black and brown neighborhoods, but also we feel the impact of anti-Muslim racism every time we hear of the hate and misogyny committed against a woman in hijab, like our very own Oscar Mahmouni at a coffee shop just minutes from my house, or the fatal terrorism against Muslims like that in the mosque in Quebec City. And though most of us would say that we feel the impact of anti-Black racism far more than Islamophobia, which makes sense given that our country was built upon Black or anti-Black racism, which pervades every institution in our society and explains why we call it systemic. We share a community with immigrants who do feel Islamophobia directly, and our relationships with them inspire some of us to fight as though we wear their shoes. We see this in the statement of NBA player Rondé Hollis Jefferson, current Brooklyn Nets forward. He said about the ban, "I feel like more people should definitely speak up and act on it because it's BS at the end of the day. Me being Muslim, me knowing a lot of Muslims, it's definitely heartbreaking to see. A lot of my college friends are Muslims, and their families are in some of these countries. Just seeing that, my heart goes out to them." It is said that it is courageous for professional athletes to speak on politics. But of course, this is the legacy of our champ, Muhammad Ali. May Allah have mercy on him. I highlight Hollis Jefferson and Ali also to note that being Black and Muslim also means that Black Muslims are the celebrity Muslims responsible for popularizing Islam in our culture. Because